The sun over the Sea of Galilee was still high and merciless when the boats finally touched the far shore, and the man stepping out of the bow had not slept in days. His name was Jesus of Nazareth, and the news that had reached him that morning had hollowed something out inside him. John, his cousin, his forerunner, the one who had waded into the Jordan River and called a nation back to God, was dead, murdered in a palace on a whim, his head delivered on a platter to satisfy a dancer's request. The disciples who came to tell Jesus the news watched his face carefully. What they saw there was grief. Real, human, quiet grief. He had pulled them into a boat and said simply that they needed to go somewhere alone. Somewhere quiet. A deserted place across the water, away from the crowds, away from the villages, away from the endless crush of need and noise. The disciples had taken up the oars without a word, but the crowds had seen them go. They had run, thousands of them, along the shoreline, through the scrubby brush and pale dust of the Galilean hills, tracking the boat with their eyes until it curved around the inlet and disappeared. And then they had run harder. They came from every village within walking distance. Mothers with children balanced on their hips, old men with walking sticks, young men with nothing to lose. They came because they had heard what this man could do. They came because they were desperate in all the ways that ordinary people are desperate, sick and scared and hungry for something they could not name. By the time the boat scraped the gravel of the far shore, the crowd was already there, waiting. There were 5,000 men, Matthew would later write, and that count did not include the women and the children. Jesus stepped out of the boat, looked out at the mass of faces, and felt something move in his chest. The Greek word the gospel uses is splagmazomai, a word so physical it almost hurts to translate. Compassion from the gut, mercy that costs something. He looked at them, and he could not turn away. He began to teach. The afternoon light slanted across the hillside as the hours burned down. The disciples moved through the crowd, listening, watching. These were not the polished disciples of Jerusalem rabbis. They were fishermen, a tax collector, ordinary men with calloused hands and complicated histories. They were used to following Jesus into uncomfortable places, but even they could feel the day beginning to shift. The shadows stretched longer. The air, which had been warm and golden, began to cool. Philip, a practical man, the kind of man who counted things, looked out at the crowd and did the arithmetic in his head. It came out wrong every way he tried it. He brought the problem to Jesus. The 12 gathered around him, and the words they used were careful but edged with something close to exasperation. This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away. Let them go into the villages and buy something to eat. It was a reasonable suggestion. It was the only reasonable suggestion. There was no food here. There were no vendors, no markets, no storerooms. There was a hillside, a crowd of thousands, and the sinking sun. But Jesus looked at them and said something that stopped them cold. Asterisk, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. Asterisk. The silence that followed must have been extraordinary. Philip, who had been running numbers in his head all afternoon, answered first. 200 denarii, he said. 200 days of wages. That would not even buy enough bread to give each person a taste. Not even a mouthful. He was not being faithless. He was being honest about the size of the impossible. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, had been moving through the edges of the crowd. He came back with a report that was almost painful in its smallness. There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. He paused. And then, because he was a man who could hear how absurd his own next words were going to sound, he said it anyway. But what are they among so many? 5 barley loaves. Barley, the bread of the poor. Dense, heavy, the cheapest grain you could buy. 2 small fish, likely dried and salted, the kind of thing a child carried in a cloth for a long walk. This was a lunch. A small lunch. A lunch for one small boy. And 5,000 men. And women. And children beyond counting. The disciples stood there in the long shadow of late afternoon, holding the arithmetic of the impossible, waiting to see what Jesus would do. What happened next, the gospel writers recorded with a precision that feels almost deliberate, as if they wanted to make sure no one could say it was exaggerated, or dreamed, or misremembered. Jesus told the disciples to have the people sit down on the grass. And they did. The crowd arranged itself in groups. Mark says groups of hundreds and fifties, an orderly pattern spreading across the hillside like a garden taking shape. From above it must have looked like something intentional. something prepared. The boy's 5 loaves and 2 fish were placed in Jesus' hands. He looked up toward heaven. He gave thanks. He broke the bread. And then he gave it to the disciples, and the disciples gave it to the crowds. What came next defies the clean language of explanation. The bread did not run out. The fish did not run out. Hands reached into baskets and pulled out more. The disciples moved through the crowd, between the groups of hundreds and fifties, and the food kept coming. Children reached up and received a piece of bread. Old men ate until they were satisfied. Women with tired eyes and dusty feet ate until they were full. 5,000 men, and the women, and the children, all of them, ate. And when it was over, Jesus told his disciples to gather up the fragments, so that nothing would be wasted. 12 baskets. 12 full baskets of broken pieces left over from 5 barley loaves and 2 dried fish. 1 basket for each disciple. 1 basket more than they had started with, multiplied past all calculation. The disciples must have stood there holding those baskets and felt the ground shift under their feet. Not the ground of the hillside, the ground of everything they thought they knew about how the world worked, about what was possible, about who it was they were following. The crowd felt it too. They began to say it aloud, the thing they had been thinking since he had healed their sick and taught them through the long afternoon. This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. Their voices rose together on the hillside as the last light left the sky. There is something in this story that reaches past theology, past doctrine, past the careful debates of scholars and councils. It reaches into something older and more elemental. It reaches into every moment a human being has ever stood in front of an impossible need with not nearly enough in their hands. Every parent who could not pay the bill. Every community stretched past its breaking point. Every person who looked at what they had to offer and heard their own voice say, "But what is this among so many?" The story does not pretend the 5 loaves were secretly 10. It does not round up the 2 fish. It holds the smallness of what was offered with complete honesty, and then it shows what happened when that small, honest thing was placed into the right hands and given away. Something about that image stays. A child's lunch. Open hands. Broken bread. Enough. The bread kept coming, and no one who reached for it was turned away.